This is John Nichols of The Nation magazine, and you're listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan, along with my co-host David Feldman. Hello, David.
Good morning.
And our producer, Hannah Feldman. Hello, Hannah.
Hey, Steve.
And the man of the hour, Ralph Nader. Hello to you also, Ralph.
Hello, everybody.
We are devoting most of today's program to the topic of artificial intelligence. On September 5th of this year, the United States signed, and this is a mouthful, folks, it's called the Council of Europe's Framework Convention on Artificial Intelligence and Human Rights, Democracy, and the Rule of Law. This is the first ever international legally binding treaty aimed at ensuring respect for all of those things: human rights, the rule of law, and democratic legal standards, all in the use of artificial intelligence systems. To discuss this historic treaty and the reason it's necessary, we'll welcome back Marc Rotenberg, who is a leading expert in data protection, open government, and AI policy. One of the dangers of AI is a thing called algorithmic bias, which can produce unfair or discriminatory outcomes in areas like healthcare or law enforcement or hiring policies. We'll also be asking him about the dangers of autonomous weapons and deep fakes. Then, to conclude the program, as we come to the end of the enrollment period for Medicare, Ralph issues a reminder to listeners about the scam that is Medicare Advantage. If you're new to the program, you won't want to miss this warning. As always, somewhere in the middle, we'll check in with our ubiquitous corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber. But first, we've been warned that AI is a monster that could possibly take over the world. Will human beings be able to tame it? David?
Marc Rotenberg is the founder and president of the Center for AI and Digital Policy, a global organization focused on emerging challenges associated with artificial intelligence. He serves as an expert advisor on AI policy to many organizations, including the Council of Europe, the Council on Foreign Relations, the European Parliament, the Global Partnership on AI, the OECD, and UNESCO. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Marc Rotenberg.
Nice to be with you. Welcome indeed, Mark. And let's start with the most basic definition, because a lot of listeners are confused. They hear the phrase artificial intelligence, then they hear the phrase generative artificial intelligence, then they hear people saying we've had artificial intelligence for decades. Look at the thermostat in your home or an automated factory line. Could you give us some definitional information here?
Sure. And just by way of background, I should say that I've been working with AI systems for many, many years. I think, as you know, Ralph, I'm a tournament chess player, and many years ago, I was writing computer programs to play chess, which we called AI systems. But what was significant about those systems in the early days is that they were basically rule-based expert systems. They were decision trees. And of course, these were the type of systems that were also being used to make credit determinations and housing determinations and employment determinations. And they've had a very big impact on life and opportunity in the American economy for many, many years. So from this perspective, the old-fashioned expert systems, which we called AI at the time, are familiar. The new AI systems moved from this rule-based transparent model to what we might think of as a statistical probabilistic model, which means now we have a tremendous amount of data, which is producing likely outcomes. So for example, with some of these new generative AI programs like ChatGPT, it's essentially predicting the next word in a sentence or the next paragraph in an essay based on an enormous amount of data. And the first thing to say about the difference between these two types of systems is that with the old ones, we could inspect them and interrogate them if one of the factors being used for an outcome was, for example, race or nationality. We could say, well, that's impermissible, and you can't use an automated system in that way. The problem today with the probabilistic systems that U.S. companies have become increasingly reliant on is that it's very difficult to actually tell whether those factors are contributing to an outcome. And so for that reason, there are a lot of computer scientists rightly concerned about the problem of algorithmic bias. And much of the focus on the regulatory front concerns how do we detect the bias that is encoded in these systems, how do we correct it, and how do we remove it? Now, this is the first two parts of what I think is actually a three-part question, because what you've also asked about is generative AI more broadly. And this is interesting as well, because you see, when you have a lot of data, it's now possible to produce synthetic output. And, we're familiar with the example of typing something into a program like ChatGPT and getting back a poem or a term paper. But in fact, these programs are much more elaborate than just generating text. They will generate music, they will generate video, they will generate computer code. And interestingly, they are increasingly being connected to physical devices in the world, which means that they have physical impact through how they operate. And it's in this third category of these large AI systems, sometimes referred to as foundational models or frontier models, that those who are most expert in the field have been putting up, red lights and warning flags and saying, wait, we've got to stop. We've got to fully understand how these systems are operating. And that's actually the genesis of SB 1047, which I know you want to talk about, and I'm sorry for this long introduction, but if your listeners can just keep in mind these basically three categories: the old style expert systems that we could understand and fix where there was a problem, the new style probabilistic systems that are really difficult to understand, and also the generative AI systems that produce synthetic output and create all sorts of issues for artists and writers and others who see their work being replicated by machines. I think you have a pretty good understanding what the landscape looks like today.
And the third one includes the emergence of autonomous weapons, which the Department of Defense is working on intensively, along with other countries in the world. Isn't that correct?
Yes, and it's, of concern to us. I won't go too far into the discussion about Gaza, but I will say that we issued a statement about the use of AI in Gaza, which we're very concerned about. It was actually the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, and the head of the International Red Cross, 2 days before October 7th and October 5th, they actually issued a statement warning that AI could create a false sense of security as to the precision of automated weapon systems. Because one of the arguments that's made for AI in warfare is that it can be more precise and it can limit civilian casualties. And frankly, many of the experts are very skeptical of this claim. And I think, unfortunately, what we've seen in Gaza is precisely what that concern was about. When you automate weapon systems, you actually lose the ability for human control because the targeting happens so quickly. This notion of human in the loop, which is a phrase a lot of people use, but I don't particularly like, it becomes meaningless because you have really no human agency controlling those systems.
Let's go to California. The democratically controlled legislature passed the first regulation of AI among state governments, and a Democratic governor, Newsom, vetoed it. Can you enlighten us about all that? What were they trying to do?
So, as I said, I'd like to provide a little bit of context because the California legislature actually got a lot of bills adopted this year. The governor did sign a lot of bills. California passed legislation concerning deep fakes, which is this third category, the creation of synthetic images, and passed legislation regarding misinformation. We worked on a bill that was enacted called the Data Transparency Act, so that at least there be more information available to the public about the data that's contained in these models. It's how we deal with this category 2 problem of these very opaque systems. So I do want to say there was some progress on several important fronts regarding AI regulation in California. And this is very important right now because, Congress has just been very slow. Although they've had lots of hearings and considered lots of bills, they've had difficulty, unfortunately, bringing bills to the floor for votes. But let's focus on SB 1047, because there's no doubt that the governor's decision to veto this bill was controversial. SB 1047, as I said, basically deals with this problem in category 3, where you have these very large AI systems. You don't know precisely how they are operating. They have consequences and impact in the physical world. And Scott Wiener, who's a representative in the California State Assembly, working with a lot of, experts and advocacy groups, put together legislation I personally thought was very good and very thoughtful. Of course, like all legislation, it wasn't perfect. Then they did make some compromises as they moved from the Assembly to the Senate. But by the time it came out of the Senate, that bill had passed 32-1. And it went to Newsom's desk, and he was heavily lobbied on both sides on the issue of signing it. And it was, at the end of the day, Silicon Valley and the tech industry that persuaded the governor not to sign it. And I think he made a big mistake. I'm just going to say, I think this decision, sometimes people make political decisions because of who influences them. The problem in this realm is that these systems are evolving so rapidly. You really need to get the safety regulations in place early on. And by putting off the decision to enact SB 1047, I think Newsom's actually made the problem more difficult to solve. So I'm happy to talk in more detail about what the bill would do and what the consequences are.
Given the margin in the Senate, why isn't the legislature in Sacramento able to override Governor Newsom's veto?
I think, they can. I think they need a 2/3 vote. I don't know what Wiener's thinking right now. I did see his statement, and it did not suggest that he was going to try to pursue to override the governor's veto. The governor did issue a statement on his veto, and he said he's going to try to bring together experts and address the problem and see if a solution can be found. I don't think he's ignoring the need for AI safety regulation. I think some people just told him that there were problems with this bill and they didn't want to comply. But I'm just going to say something else about who this bill was going to cover, because I think this story is not well understood. There is no doubt that this was targeting the largest AI companies. The systems that would be regulated were those that, cost more than $100 million to develop or had very high levels of compute capacity. This was not a regulation that was going to, hit small companies unless, in fact, their product caused some harm. So I think the arguments against the bill weren't completely honest.
What did the bill provide for in summary, in terms of regulation?
So basically, they wanted companies that were building these big, complicated systems to undertake a safety plan, identify the harms, and make those plans available to the Attorney General. We would almost think of this like an environmental impact assessment that might be an obligation imposed on a manufacturer that wants to construct a plant. And in fact, I work with many governments around the world on AI regulation, and this concept of having an impact assessment is fairly obvious. You don't want to build these large, complex systems without some assessment of what the risk might be. So that was the first requirement. The primary requirement really was to undertake that detailed assessment. But another key requirement in the bill was basically an off switch, because if you reach a moment where you're running one of these large, complicated systems that's maybe operating a network of autonomous vehicles or medical devices, and you realize that, in fact, you can't adequately control the system, the proposal in the legislation was to say you have an obligation to turn that system off and have the ability, I should say precisely, you need to have the ability to turn that system off, which also seems to me fairly obvious from a regulatory perspective. We've always understood that when you create devices that have consequences, there has to be basically a circuit breaker. The companies didn't like that either. They said it's too difficult to predict what those scenarios might be, but that was almost precisely the point of the legislation, you see, because if those scenarios exist and you haven't yet identified them, yet you choose to deploy these large foundational models without any safety mechanism in place, all of us are at risk. So I thought it was an important bill, and not only am I disappointed that the governor vetoed it, but as I said, I think he made a mistake. This is not simply about politics. This is actually about science, and it's about the direction these systems are heading.
Mark, I want to get your view on something that is worrying a lot of people on the ground, millions of people who live near these huge data centers, like in Virginia. And these data centers devour enormous amount of energy, so much so that it's going to create an increasing global warming problem because the energy is heavily fossil fuel. And even worse, Microsoft has just cut an agreement with electric company to revive one of the plants at 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania, the nuclear plants. They want to revive closed down nuclear plants because the energy requirements of these data centers is so massive. Has anybody ever done an evaluation of the social utility that comes out of every billion BTUs of energy here? I mean, this is almost like a data riot without a social utility evaluation in terms of the well-being that's served for the people by these technologies.
Yeah, Ralph, that's a great question. I'm really glad you brought up this topic. As I said, we've been working with a number of governments and international organizations on AI governance. And in the early days, we were focused mostly on issues related to fairness and transparency. But I can tell you that several years ago, working with UNESCO, the issue of sustainability came up, because that was when it first became clear that these large language models were going to consume enormous amounts of data. Enormous amounts of energy. And the initial response from the industry was, well, we'll manage that. Don't worry about it. It's not going to be a big problem. But that changed very quickly. And you had Sam Altman, I think, a year ago at Davos, telling world leaders that they're going to have to come up with more energy sources for him to be able to build his company out. I think there was a meeting, in fact, in the White House just in the last couple of weeks with leading people from AI firms talking to the White House about new energy sources. And to me, I'm not an expert on environmentalism, but I'm just sort of struck that in this moment when governments are working to try to address, it's not a climate change, it's a climate catastrophe, I think, as people have rightly said. Along comes an industry that says, we need new sources of energy to power our systems. To your precise question, I don't know if there has yet been this scientific assessment of the benefits of, enormous energy consumption. I do know that in the context of impact assessments, increasingly governments are now saying there needs to be, before a system is deployed, some type of environmental assessment of the energy requirements that will be required. And this is all just, to me, very sensible regulation. I don't think it's about, shutting things down. I think it's about assessing consequences before moving forward.
It just seems to be necessary to have a broader social evaluation of this data riot. It's data. We need more data, more energy to fuel these data centers. It's like a riot without a social evaluation. How's this going to help average people? How's this going to help the local environment? Are you seeing here the creation of a sub-economy of immense profit by NVIDIA and Microsoft and these other companies that may create a boom into an eventual bust?
Well, I don't know about the bust, but it was actually in today's Wall Street Journal. They had a new valuation of OpenAI. I think it went from 85 billion to 167 billion, which I'm sure on the investor side is great news. But of course, the other thing to know about OpenAI is that many of the top people, the top scientists, the people who are working in the ethics field and the misinformation field, have all left the company. And the indicators there are that this is really a company now that's, out of control. And of course, they are in a very competitive position with Google and Meta and Anthropic and others. So this is actually the time where I think there's real urgency for the government agencies that do have some authority and the responsibility to step up. We filed a complaint with the Federal Trade Commission a year ago, March, and we said to the FTC, you have authority to act under Section 5, and you need to establish guardrails for OpenAI and other similar firms. We know they opened the investigation. There was reporting in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal last summer, but they haven't concluded the investigation. They haven't established the guardrails. And I think the larger question, which you raise is, where is the benefit for the broader society is still an open question. We need to find ways to ensure that these new technologies do provide broad social benefit and not just increasing concentrations of power.
Well, let's go to the subject that has taken endless hours by you as the Executive Director of the Center for Artificial Intelligence and Digital Policy. And it's basically a treaty, listeners, but it's called the First Ever Framework Convention on Artificial Intelligence and Human Rights, Democracy, and the Rule of Law. Bring us up to date on that, from the State Department to the Council of Europe.
Well, we're actually, Ralph, very proud of this. As I said, we've been working on AI governance for a number of years with a number of different organizations. We think this is the most successful result and the one with the best opportunity to establish meaningful oversight of AI systems. Just a brief background, the Council of Europe was actually established after the Second World War to bring together democratic nations. There are many important treaties associated with the Council of Europe. Remarkably, Council of Europe treaties are open for signature by both member states and non-member states. And in the development of the AI treaty, we had, Canada, US, Mexico, Japan, and others all participating in the negotiation, drafting, and the outcome. So even though it says Council of Europe, other countries can sign. In fact, the US led the way a number of years ago on a Council of Europe cybercrime convention. This particular treaty focuses on the three main pillars of the Council of Europe, which are the protection of human rights, democracy, and the rule of law, which is also very much aligned with the mission of our organization, Center for AI and Digital Policy. We think it is a very important framework, but there's also a lot of work ahead. We think this is the best way to keep AI aligned with the goals of fundamental rights, democracy, and the rule of law.
Does it include autonomous weapons, or it doesn't reach that far?
No, it doesn't. A lot of us argued for that. We didn't get everything in. National defense systems were excluded. That work is continuing at the United Nations. We're also involved in that process. But I think for what the Council of Europe Treaty aims to do on AI, it does it quite well. And we very much hope this will move forward.
What troubles me, Mark, is the gap between an increasingly obscure technical and complex technology abbreviated into AI and public understanding. When motor vehicles came and we tried to regulate them and people understood motor vehicles in their daily lives. When solar energy started coming on, they saw solar roof panels. They could see it. They could understand it. They could actually work putting solar panels on roofs of buildings. This area is just producing a massively expanding gap between the experts from various disciplines and the power structure of corporatism and their government servants and the rest of the people in the world. Does that trouble you? And explain why, if it does trouble you.
Yeah, it does, Ralph. And I'm very glad, you gave that example. I mean, of course, I remember your work on auto regulation, but what was also interesting in that moment, was that people understood cars, they understood engines. It was not that complex to talk about, for example, the thickness of brake linings. That world has changed. This world has evolved very rapidly. And as I said, I got started in this world. I wrote these programs. And then I, went off, became a lawyer, came back and tried to understand these probabilistic learning models. And I just couldn't, But what was interesting to me is that the experts didn't really understand them either. And when you had the leading experts in this field, I don't know if you know some of these names, but Stuart Russell or Yoshua Bengio or Jeffrey Hinton, these are all considered to be sort of the people who've created these modern day techniques, saying we don't understand now how they operate. that's really a very interesting moment. It reminded me of Computer Professionals for Social Responsibility a number of years ago, warning about the use of computer systems in weaponry, precisely because the outcomes were so predictable. But I think, as you're suggesting also, because it's so difficult for most people to comprehend what's going on. And that's actually why I took a moment at the outset of your program to try to explain the difference. And it is important between the old-fashioned decision tree, rule-based expert systems that we could understand and interrogate and correct, and these modern probabilistic statistical systems where we really don't understand why certain results are being produced. We can't prove outcomes. And from a simple scientific perspective, we like to think that there's a way to establish why a recommendation has been presented and not simply rely on the fact that the machine is supposed to be expert. That's where we are in this moment. Opaque systems that the experts don't understand, increasingly being deployed by organizations that also don't understand these systems, and an industry that says, don't regulate us. This is not going to end well.
And driven by profit rather than public interest values. Let's focus on a slice of the public here that is rarely discussed: the engineering profession, the scientific profession, and the professional associations like the Society for Electrical Engineers, or the National Academy of Science, or the National Academy of Engineering, or the Society of Mechanical Engineers, or the ISO, International Standards Organization. What are they doing in terms of engaging the kind of issues, missions, challenges, and solutions that you've been working on and we've been talking about?
Well, let me say, first of all, two of the associations that we work with, and I have a lot of, actually three now, I have a lot of regard for. I mean, the Association for Computing Machinery, which is the ACM, and the IEEE, and the American Association for the Advancement of Sciences, all of them worked with me a number of years ago when we drafted a framework called the Universal Guidelines for AI. And I'd actually encourage your listeners, if they have a moment and they're interested in this topic, to go online and look up Universal Guidelines for AI. I actually think we got a lot right in the early days because we were.
Why don't you give the website right now, Mark?
Well, the phrase will be, as I said, just Universal Guidelines for AI. It's not hard to find. But as I said, to your point, Ralph, this is actually a reflection of the insight and expertise of the computer scientists who we were working with to try to imagine the broad principles for an effective framework. And I will say one of the key lessons that we took from that exercise that continues to influence our work is the need for prohibitions, red lines, for certain AI systems. Because what oftentimes happens in these discussions is the expert uncovers a problem and the company wants to go forward with a system and says, maybe with good intent to the expert, well, how do we fix this? And the expectation is the problem can be fixed. But sometimes actually the expert says this simply should not be done, right? And there are actually a lot of AI systems that simply should not be deployed. We said, for example, in our universal guidelines, when we set out a termination obligation, which is a big part of SB 1047, if you can't maintain human control of an AI system, it's actually your responsibility to be able to turn it off. So when Scott Wiener introduced the off switch in his proposal, that looked very familiar to me, because that's actually what we had said a number of years ago in those universal guidelines. A bit of good news here, by the way. I do want to say that as we've worked over the years with a number of these governments and international organizations, we are seeing prohibitions for AI systems being adopted into recommendations and legal frameworks. UNESCO, for example, said in its recommendation on AI ethics, you should not use AI systems for mass surveillance or social scoring. And social scoring, of course, is the practice of some governments of trying to rate their citizens by their degree of patriotism. But from UNESCO's perspective, that simply shouldn't be allowed. The new Artificial Intelligence Act from the European Union has 8 categories of prohibited AI systems. And I think several of them you'll appreciate, Ralph, because I know you raised these issues over the years. They prohibit the use of AI for subliminal advertising. It's not a problem that you fix or refine. It's an application that simply should not be deployed. So as for the role of experts, I think this is, a difficult challenge. I think they're going to need to be able to say in their companies and to their government agencies, this simply shouldn't happen.
Do you have anything to say, Mark, about the bar associations here, whether they're engaged, our profession, state bar associations, American Bar Association, Chicago, and labor unions who are concerned about AI automating workers out of the economic system entirely?
Right. So on the second question, actually, we had a very good conversation with representatives from AFL-CIO earlier this week. They've set up a new tech center focusing specifically on AI policy. I think this administration has been listening to labor's concerns about AI and its impact on the workforce. It's a topic we haven't really discussed, but I would say that, the unions have done a good job and the administration has also done a good job trying to address this challenge. It's not going to be easy to solve because if you look at the reports from McKinsey and others, the expectation is that over time, AI replaces a lot of the workforce, which is what's driving up the valuation of these AI companies. So that challenge is going to be with us. As for the role of the bar associations, there's a lot of concern right now about when is it appropriate to use AI as a lawyer. The American Bar Association this year updated its ethical guidance, which I think was necessary. But the larger question that I think lawyers need to be thinking about, and this is the work we did with the International Bar Association, is really the social obligation of lawyers to ensure adequate methods for AI governance. So it's not simply about how you use AI in your relationship with your clients or when you're presenting documents to a court. It's also thinking seriously about what the consequences will be with the deployment of these AI systems and what role law should play in safeguarding the public. And we actually addressed this issue in the report we did with the International Bar Association out just this last month. That report was titled, "The Future is Now, AI in the Legal Profession," and it speaks both to the internal obligation of lawyers as professionals, but also the external role in terms of obligations to the society.
I raised it because beware of fast evolving technology without legal and ethical frameworks and increasingly beyond the effective limits of legal action spells danger. Serious danger when it's wedded to the profit system and to military objectives. Now, the last constituency is medical. There was an article recently in one of the major newspapers. It was titled something like this: "Ask your doctor a question and you get a response from an AI robot." Comment?
Well, this is a real concern right now. I mean, there are whole fields, therapy, for example. You take that online and you substitute a chatbot for a professionally trained physician. The commercial opportunities are, beyond belief, but so too would be the impact on the profession. I know the medical profession is wrestling with these issues. There are some ways in which, you can provide access for people who may not be able to obtain expensive services if you're able to automate some of these processes. So I wouldn't necessarily say that there's no role for AI in the delivery of medical care. At the level of basic research, there have been some extraordinary breakthroughs enabled by AI, and I anticipate there will certainly be more in the future. But I remain concerned, as I said at the outset, about this second category of artificial intelligence, where we see these very impressive outcomes, but we don't fully understand how they came about. We're now at the point in the chess world where, artificial intelligence can recommend moves that are better than the world champion. But if you were to try to ask the program, well, why this particular move, it's almost impossible to understand. And if we reach this point with the delivery of medical services, it will be quite dangerous You'll have a lot of data to show that a particular system is doing better than the human provider in the same setting, which will build a lot of confidence in support of the automated system. But when something fails, it may be almost impossible to understand why. And it could be catastrophic because the other characteristic of AI systems is that they tend to be highly networked. And when you have a failure in one place, you can have a failure in multiple places. Returning to the example of automobiles, I mean, a car crashes, it's a terrible thing. But if you have 10,000 cars on the same network and there's a flaw in the software or a decision made by an AI system about how to automate traffic flow at a particular time of day, it's not one car that's at risk. It could be 10,000.
Yeah, well, that's a very scary phenomena that is being considered by auto safety advocates in recent years. Let's look at the possibility here of the Frankenstein scenario, where these robots become self-generating, self-deciding, self-replicating, and turn against humans, and they turn against them in uncontrollable ways. Before listeners think this is pie-in-the-sky science fiction, 10 years ago, there was a widely circulated letter by leading scientists and technologists in the world warning about the Armageddon end of this trend here. It was led by Stephen Hawking in England and many other prominent scientists. It was a 1 or 2 day story, and then the world turned its back on it. You want to foresee something like this, or is it too debilitating for sustaining public interest in this subject matter?
Well, I think we need to talk about it. I mean, the Hawking letter was important. A couple of years ago, I actually signed a letter calling for a 6-month pause. That letter was signed by the people I mentioned earlier, Benjo and Russell and Hinton, and Elon Musk, by the way, signed that letter calling for the 6-month pause. And what was striking to me was that, like Hawking, I mean, these are very smart people who understand the technology and are issuing the warning. The sense, I would say, before Hawking's time was that it was a long way off before we needed to consider, whether machines would outpace the intelligence of people. But I do think that there was a sense, because machines can be programmed to be self-learning, that once that occurs, we don't catch up. They race ahead. And I know sometimes when this conversation happens, people get concerned about the use of the term intelligence and whether we're really talking about a device that thinks in the way that humans do. But to me, that's actually a bit of a distraction, because what will matter will be the extent to which we have delegated decisions to these machines that are producing outcomes that we don't fully understand. So whether they're intelligent, human sensory way almost won't matter if they are managing traffic control systems and airline systems and communication networks and electrical grids and everything else. That's really where the risk lies. And to me, it's not about the human in the loop. It's about the human in charge, and the AI in the loop, maybe, if there has been a prior impact assessment and ongoing evaluation. I think that's the only configuration in which we are able to maintain control of these systems.
Let's go to Steve.
Mark, I saw a video of the late great physicist Richard Feynman in 1985, and they were not using the term AI back then. They were basically saying computers, and the general question was about computers replacing us in various functions. And he said something that resonated with me, because he said, the fastest mammal in the world is the cheetah, and we have learned how to locomote faster than the cheetah, but we would never be able to run like a cheetah. And he said the same thing about birds, that we've learned to fly higher and faster than any bird, but we need to shoot hot air through a tube in order to do it. So we can't do it like a bird. So my question is Richard Feynman still right about this from 1985?
Okay, I'm not sure if I understand that we can't compete with AI, or that we have unique characteristics with regard to
that we
AI?
will never be replaced by AI, because AI can never really do anything like we do it completely.
I think what Steve is saying, there's a qualitative dimension to organic life that cannot be replicated by the quantitative supremacy of robotics or artificial intelligence. Is that fair, Steve?
That's probably a much better way
Right.
to.
So I understand your question now. I think I have a pretty good answer because I have been thinking about this topic for some time. And I remember a few years ago reading a book by a famous computer scientist from China named Kai-Fu Lee, who actually set up the AI lab for Google and worked for Microsoft, and very well regarded, as a computer scientist, but also as a thoughtful person that has written a number of books about the impact of technology. So he writes this book called The AI Superpowers and talks about a future in which, in fact, we are increasingly replaced, at least in the labor realm, for the work that we produce, because so many of the things that we do, in fact, can be automated. That's his premise. But he concludes by saying, but at least we will be able to love one another. We will be able to express empathy. We will continue to do those things that are uniquely human. Now, I didn't find that conclusion, completely satisfying, but the story gets a little bit better because I actually had, Kai-Fu Lee's thoughts in mind when I started reading about a new company that Reid Hoffman had helped launch in the AI world that basically has the precise purpose of replacing human empathy. Yes? So what it was that Kai-Fu Lee was telling us was uniquely human, Reid and some of his other friends think can also be automated. And coming back to our earlier conversation about online therapy, for example, there's a huge market there. So, I'm not sure that Feynman is still correct. At least people are looking for the opportunity to replicate, and replicate's a good word in this conversation, replicate as much human activity as is possible.
We certainly miss Richard Feynman, right, Steve?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
David?
Is there a concerted effort to dehumanize humans? I don't mean to get too deep here, but it sure feels like if you don't pay attention, there's a dehumanization going on. And is that going to contribute to AI taking over? And what does dehumanization mean?
I think that's a very good question. I've thought about that one also over the years. Part of what concerns me about the period that we're going through now is that so much of our lives have been made transparent, recorded, reduced to data, consolidated in data sets, at the same time that the machines that are doing the processing have become increasingly opaque. And to me, this is a form of information asymmetry that is actually a threat to democratic government. When I think about dehumanization in this context, I think about the way in which decisions are made about people that they can't control or unaware of, and even an expert may not be able to comprehend. So, superficially, we all see one another, we talk with one another, we have meals together, we have, loads and loads of human experiences. But in terms of consequential decisions that impact our lives, a lot of that is being removed from a realm that we can understand and actively participate in.
This recalls the practice in Sweden that our listeners might want to know about. Sweden has a government that when there's a major decision to be made, they develop town meetings, which they fund all over Sweden to have the citizenry come discuss, learn, ask questions, and listen. And they did this on whether to increase the construction of nuclear power, Mark. They had these meetings all over Sweden. Don't you think that would be a good model in this area where the government actually goes to the communities and develops a more informed public?
It's so interesting that you raised that example, Ralph. I did not mention earlier, but one of the big projects my organization undertakes each year is the Artificial Intelligence and Democratic Values Index. And we actually look at the policies and practices of countries around the world on AI. We rate them and we rank them. And we have 12 metrics in our methodology. And one of our metrics in evaluating the democratic governance of AI is whether governments have provided meaningful opportunity for public participation in the development of national AI strategy. We have a related question that asks, has the government made materials available to the public so that the public is informed about the development of national AI strategy? And our thinking, obviously, is that we need to identify the characteristics that will help enable public engagement as these policies are established. That report's available online also. It's called, as I said, Artificial Intelligence and Democratic Values. It's very detailed, and our aim is obviously to promote more openness and more accountability in these AI policies.
Before we go to Hannah, can you give the website slowly and twice so people can access a lot more information?
So basically, there are two good ways to find our materials online. Our website is simply the acronym for the organization. So Center for AI and Digital Policy is caidp.org. So you can start there, but you can also use the search phrases. So earlier I mentioned the Universal Guidelines for AI, our big report, Artificial Intelligence and Democratic Values. And we've also published a report regarding the need for the FTC to act on our OpenAI complaint. And that search phrase would be still no guardrails.
Hannah?
Mark, my question is about separating scientific inquiry from commercial development. How important is it to, I'm not going to sit here and say it's not important to continue pushing the limits of science for, discovery and expanding our knowledge of the universe, but it kind of seems like most of the problems we encounter with technology like AI is the commercial applications. Is it even worth it?
Well, it's a great question, Hannah. And it is because of the commercial pressure that when we went to the FTC, we weren't saying that they needed to regulate, every computer that has an AI program. We were saying that the FTC should look at the consumer products that are AI-based and use its authority to establish necessary safeguards or guardrails. And it's precisely because of the commercial pressure in the marketplace that if the FTC fails to act, you can almost be certain of a race to the bottom. I mean, that's basically the experience we've seen in, every single sector without some type of protections being established. Now, my hope, and we've done some work on this front, is that if you set objectively positive regulation, for example, small data models should be preferred because they would have less of an environmental impact, less of a risk to personal privacy or copyright interests, and you drive the commercial product toward that positive goal, you have, both innovation and public safety, which is where I think we need to head. So regulation is really important in this space to ensure that the AI that's being produced is aligned with the public interest. As to the research that takes place within the companies, I mean, my caution there is simply that these systems are highly networked. And you do have to understand that, for example, when you're working with dangerous chemicals, even if they're within the walls of your company, you still have safety obligations, to your workers and to others. And that's also true with some of these AI systems.
Isn't the first step in regulation of AI labeling? Can you explain that?
Labeling is useful in the development of models because it helps make them more precise in their ability to assess objects in the physical world. Although I will say increasingly, machines learn how to do this. In fact, this is what basically self-learning is. After you've processed 1,000 photographs of a cat from across the internet, the machines are actually quite good at the next 1,000 or the next million images. We don't see that type of labeling as critical. We do see data sources. So this is interesting. You said earlier, Ralph, these, it's like a data riot. I mean, the phrase I sometimes use, it's other people's data that's being used to build these models. It's, it's the work of authors. It's the music of artists that is being digitized and put into these large AI models to create new books and new songs. So we want to know where that data is coming from and if it was lawful when it was acquired.
Well, I meant consumer labeling. For example, when you ask your doctor a question about your health and it comes back by AI robotic transmission, the patient is able to determine that it was an AI processed respond rather than one personally by their doctor. That's what I meant.
So in fact, actually, some states have enacted laws that do require companies to disclose when AI is used to produce a result. I think that can be helpful, although I am a little bit concerned that people not be overwhelmed by these notices, because if they receive too many of these notices, or if they can't actually act on the information, it may end up not being useful and it may not have much of a market impact. I think at the end of the day, what's most crucial is to impose the necessary safeguards on the companies in the development and deployment of these systems so that, consumers aren't expected to become AI experts and try to assess the significance, let's say, of the role of AI in a medical diagnosis.
Well, we've reached the end of our time. We've been talking with Marc Rotenberg, who is the founder and chair of the Center for Artificial Intelligence and Digital Policy. And listeners, if you want more information, you got the website. Thank you very much, Marc. This clearly is a subject to be continued.
Thank you, Ralph. It was great speaking with you and great to be on your show.
We've been speaking to Marc Rotenberg. We will link to his important work at ralphnaderradiohour.com. We're going to take a 1-minute break, and then when we come back, Ralph has one final warning about Medicare disadvantage.
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Friday, November 29, 2024. I'm Russell Mokhiber. Independent journalist Lee Fong is reporting that representatives of companies that make snack foods, sugary beverages, and cooking oils are already meeting to discuss how to thwart the reform agenda of Robert F. Kennedy Jr., the former consumer rights attorney. President-elect Donald Trump has said he will nominate to lead the Department of Health and Human Services. Their response provides an early example of what experts predict will be a massive effort by D.C. lobbyists to position their clients in response to Trump's pledge to change how Washington does business. Kennedy is a longtime critic of the food industry, which he says is a leading contributor to America's obesity epidemic. Kennedy argues that Americans are being mass poisoned by big pharma and big food. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you, Russell. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. I'm Steve Scrovan, along with David Feldman, Hannah, and Ralph. Ralph, you have a reminder for our listeners.
Well, this Medicare disadvantage, which I've mentioned before, the enrollment period for Medicare for elderly beneficiaries ends on December 5th. So the massive advertising is intensifying everywhere you go, in the mails, on TV, cable, social media, by the giant insurance companies that are undermining and taking over traditional Medicare, with the help, I might say, of both parties on Capitol Hill over the years. So over 50% of elderly beneficiaries have been lured into this Medicare disadvantage, which is full of freebie this and freebie that. The ads are extremely tempting, clever, and deceptive. They don't mention that Medicare disadvantage has a higher denial rate than traditional Medicare. It forces you into narrow networks of doctors and hospitals, so you lose your free choice of doctor and hospital. It drives doctors crazy with the prior authorization, where they have these employed physicians in some remote places looking over requests by doctors for coverage concerning a procedure for the patient and turn it down. They don't often have their medical records or anything. It's just what can make more money for Aetna, for United Healthcare, for Humana, and other giant underminers and saboteurs of traditional Medicare. So as Dr. Fred Hyde has said, it's not what you pay, it's what you get. So they try to lure people in how less money they have to pay, but they don't tell them that when they're sick and they really need the insurance, that's where the corporate cost-cutting kicks into effect in terms of prior authorization denials and other denials of benefits. And also, if you get drawn into Medicare Disadvantage, some listeners, it's hard to go back. They've made it very difficult to go back to traditional Medicare. Health Research Group of Public Citizen just spoke out against it on Amy Goodman, as they have over the years. So be very aware. Just stay with traditional Medicare and don't allow the corporatists to destroy what was partially a single-payer system for elderly people enacted under the Lyndon Baines Johnson administration in the 1960s. I don't know whether you've seen this, Steve and David and Hannah. The ads are incredibly tempting and deceptive. They almost are at a frequency of the late-stage ads by the Republicans and Democrats during the campaign. They bump into each other. There's so many of them.
Oh, yeah, especially in cable news, which has an older audience, and they're tapping into that. If I may interject, Ralph, David and I are fortunate enough to be covered by the Writers Guild of America health plan, which they always call a Cadillac plan, which means it actually covers things. So maybe, Medicare Disadvantage, we could call, say, the Ford Pinto plan, which blows up.
Or the old VW Beetle plan.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a broken down convertible.
Or it's a rickshaw. It's the rickshaw plan.
What about the Corvair? Does anybody remember a car called the Corvair?
Oh, that seems to ring a bell.
Anybody?
Unfortunately, it's working. They have lunches, free lunches for elderly people, and it's the way they screen out the more ailing elderly people because they can't go to the free lunch from their home. It's very devious, very Machiavellian.
Yeah. I want to thank our guest again, Marc Rotenberg. For those of you listening on the radio, that's our show. For you podcast listeners, stay tuned for some bonus material we call The Wrap-Up, featuring Francesco DeSantis with In Case You Haven't Heard. A transcript of this program will appear on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour Substack site soon after the episode is posted.
Subscribe to us on our Ralph Nader Radio Hour YouTube channel. And for Ralph's weekly column, it's free. Go to nader.org. For more from Russell Mokhiber, go to corporatecrimereporter.com.
The American Museum of Tort Law has gone virtual. Go to tortmuseum.org to explore the exhibits, take a virtual tour, and learn about iconic tort cases from history.
To order your copy of The Capitol Hill Citizen, Democracy Dies in Broad Daylight, go to capitolhillcitizen.com.
And remember to continue the conversation after each show. Go to the comments section at ralphnaderradiohour.com and post a comment or question on this week's episode.
The producers of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour are Jimmy Lee Wirt, Hannah Feldman, and Matthew Marin. Our executive producer is Alan Minsky.
Our theme music, Stand Up, Rise Up, was written and performed by Kemp Harris. Our proofreader is Elizabeth Solomon.
Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you, everybody.
Don't let them fool you. You have the power in your hand. I'm only trying to school you.